The context that this movement is performed is extremely important to how it's actually performed in real life. The history of Thailand is very interesting in that they were never colonized, and the actual warrior culture that emerged from that type of conquering mentality is now permeated in the actual Nak Muays, or the Muay Thai athletes themselves. Now, it's a very brutal sport. Each weapon has that you're making contact with, like bone on bone a lot of the time, right? And this particular athlete here, he's practicing using the actual implements that most Nak Muays use every day, right? So they're just making as much contact as possible with as much force as possible with each strike. Elbows first, short range, knees, longer range. He's about to do some kicks to push his opponent back. Nak Muays, they stay put. They don't back up. And the swing kick, which he's about to perform, right, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So it's a long-range weapon. Basically, they're just trying to take the tibia and jam it as hard as possible into their opponent, into the wrist, into the rib cage, right? A high kick into the skull, low kick into the meaty part of your leg, quadriceps, hamstrings, etc. The movement that's closest to Muay Thai swing kick in terms of other, and in relation to other sports and things, is actually ballet. It's much like doing an arabesque or spinning on one leg, and actually dancers usually learn it fastest, which is kind of ironic. But this particular gentleman, when he does his swing kick, it's much like getting hit with a baseball bat. And one of the reasons for that is that his effective mass at contact is extremely high because of how stiff he can make the rest of his body and how synchronized he is. So the weight shift forward creates the actual momentum and motion. The rotation on the one leg speeds it up, and then at impact everything is stiff. The leg comes back pretty easily. So here's the 4 steps in relatively slow motion. This is actually myself doing it. And take the step forward. Leg sort of flies at the opponent. Everything is stiff at impact. Glutes and everything. There's actually a difference between a hamstring-driven kick and a glute-driven kick. So you can see and hear how much force is being put into those pads and why you need to have very conditioned shins to make that amount of contact. So what we've been working on for the last 3 years, as I've been getting better and better at this, right, is just pretty much the speed of the travel of the leg and synchronization of the body, making sure that there's no weight shift backwards, and just, being strong was never really an issue. When I was in my yellow shorts here, I was, lifting pretty much the same amount as I am now, probably even stronger then, but my body isn't synchronized very much, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of technique and just motor pattern learning. The one in the gray, that's me a year later from the one in the yellow, and things are synchronized a little bit more. My body is at least pointing in the same direction as my shin, but I was still leaning backwards too much. Even in the gray here, I'm leaning backwards too much. The only reason that I'm leaning backwards in the white there, right, is that this gentleman who's holding for me is just taller than what I'm used to. But in the yellow here again, leaning too far backwards. Right? So if we shift to somebody who's very inexperienced, this gentleman is actually, he's my brother. He does staged combat, so he fights for theater, and his technique is very different. Still very fast, very powerful guy. He's stronger than me. He's a competitive Olympic weightlifter, actually. But the movement is synchronized, and he's not used to creating power because he's used to actually preserving his combatants on stage. So he snaps his leg, and he'll actually be able to hold it there and make it look like he hit you or whatever, but it isn't done with the same intent. So there's not as much force going into the pads. You see that his pad holder isn't really having to do much work because he leans so far back. There's so much force going away from his stance leg and away from the opponent that he's not making as much force. Period. Right? There might be as much torque, but it's not going in the same direction. It's not traveling into the pads. So if we see here as he stands and just makes contact, right, freeze frame, the synchronization in his body just wasn't there, right? So as much as these things are important, right, all of the hip mobility that you can gather and the strength that you can gather, right, motor learning is still the most important thing, right? So training can be done to enhance these things, but being able to maintain a stable and tall trunk doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to swing kick very well. It'll take a long time. Like I said, 3 years in my case to be able to get anywhere near what I thought was something close to proficiency with it. So we want to be able to develop somebody's balance, their quad and glute strength, their core strength and endurance and calf strength, so they can post up on their leg and stay stable, right? Proprioception is a key there. But the main thing, right, is just over and over and over again, practice. So this is myself when I was first starting out, about 6 months in, I think, to doing it. So not really green, but really my hips are not coming over. I'm not sort of standing tall in my chest at all, right? It's basically pointing forward, so it's all leg. There's very little momentum that's gathered from the rest of my body. Some of them are okay, but it's really nowhere consistent and nowhere near as good as it could be. So you see there my chest is actually pointing towards my opponent instead of in the same direction that my tibia should be. Here, almost a year later, hitting a bag is actually easier than hitting pads for me at this point, just because that's what I was using mostly to practice. But the big thing here is that my weight is still being transferred sort of away from the bag. You can actually see me sort of falling backwards after I make contact a few times, and that's a big sort of sap of the amount of energy you're able to transfer into your opponent's effective mass. It's actually traveling away from the bag. You see here my stance leg, big angle. It's never going to be sort of a positive angle. If it is, that means I'm going to fall down, but you want it to be as close to up and down as possible. So here was probably the closest I ever had to eureka moment from coaching, right? The pad holder, he's going to basically show me that I need to stomp into the ground more so that I'm actually engaging the muscles in my legs with a higher rate so that I will lean back less, right? It takes time. Each time we're sort of working on it. Not that big of a change, right? But that's the time it takes with a complex movement like this, especially somebody like I started when I was 28 years old. So it takes a while to get somebody who'd really been playing hockey all his life to be able to move anywhere close to like a Thai person would. So at contact, here's at the beginning of that session before the coaching correction. And the hips are relatively good. They're stacked and everything, but it's a little bit better, right, with this angle. Just not quite falling as far back as it was before. So again, the most important training thing for a aspiring Nok Muay is pad and bag work, right? It doesn't matter how much strength you have to be able to synchronize all of your joints and make it so that that movement is optimized. But if there is a strength deficiency, right, single-legged deadlift, hip airplanes where you start off with a single-legged deadlift and then pop your hip up towards the ceiling, can be done explosively too, so it's very good. Must have a strong core. Squat and deadlift are key, but you have to be able to do power movements as well. So the muscle firing patterns are the same, right? Impulse at the beginning, relaxation, and then impulse again at the end.